I think more shock and dauntingness was more of the feeling I felt. But it was, the thing is, I think I was on such a high anyway, and so was Catherine.
A single sentence spoken behind closed palace doors was enough to send shockwaves through royal circles and ignite one of the most explosive discussions surrounding the monarchy in recent memory. According to reports circulating among royal commentators, a trusted member of the royal security team allegedly approached Prince William with information that threatened to unravel a growing controversy. The claim was startling, not because of the money involved, not because of the people being discussed, but because of what the allegations seemed to suggest. If true, it would raise serious questions about trust, loyalty, and the lengths some individuals might be willing to go in order to protect themselves from scrutiny. At first, the story sounded almost impossible to believe. How could a routine internal matter evolve into a situation involving accusations, hidden financial questions, and a security official reportedly willing to speak out? Why were so many royal observers suddenly discussing Princess Diana's legacy? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly convinced Prince William that something wasn't adding up? As speculation intensified, one detail continued attracting attention. The issue reportedly began with a series of financial concerns connected to charitable activities associated with causes long linked to Princess Diana's memory. What initially appeared to be a minor administrative question gradually transformed into something far more significant. The deeper people looked, the more complicated the situation seemed to become. Yet what makes this story particularly fascinating is not the allegation itself. It is the possibility that someone inside the system may have decided they could no longer remain silent. And if that is true, then the events that followed may reveal far more than anyone originally expected. Because before any dramatic claims emerged, before any accusations were made, and before palace insiders reportedly began asking difficult questions, there was a small detail that caught Prince William's attention. A detail that many others overlooked. And according to some observers, that single discovery may have set everything else in motion. For several months, conversations surrounding one charitable initiative appeared entirely routine on the surface. Reports were filed, public appearances continued, and official responsibilities moved forward without attracting unusual attention. To most people, there was nothing remarkable about the situation. But behind the scenes, questions were beginning to emerge. It reportedly started when several figures connected to administrative oversight noticed inconsistencies that seemed difficult to explain. Individually, the issues appeared minor. A delayed document here, an unusual approval process there, small discrepancies that could easily be dismissed as clerical mistakes. Yet when viewed together, they formed a pattern. And patterns have a way of attracting attention. According to royal commentators who later discussed the matter, Prince William was informed that certain records required additional review. At first, there was no assumption of wrongdoing. In large organizations, administrative errors happen. Documents are misplaced. Procedures are delayed. Explanations are usually straightforward. However, what made the situation unusual was the frequency with which new questions appeared just as previous questions were being resolved. Each answer seemed to create another mystery. The more information investigators reviewed, the more they found themselves circling back to the same concern. Why were certain records so difficult to verify? That question soon became impossible to ignore. As additional reviews reportedly took place, attention gradually shifted away from paperwork and toward people. Who had access? Who approved decisions? Who benefited from those decisions? And why did certain individuals appear unusually nervous whenever the subject was discussed? Observers claim this was the moment when the issue stopped looking like a simple administrative problem. Something larger appeared to be hiding beneath the surface. Prince William, who has consistently emphasized transparency regarding charitable work associated with Princess Diana's legacy, was reportedly unwilling to dismiss the concerns without further examination. If there was a reasonable explanation, he wanted to find it. If there wasn't, he wanted answers. That determination reportedly led to a deeper review. And it was during that stage that an unexpected name allegedly entered the conversation. A member of the royal security team. At first, nobody understood why a security official would have any connection to questions involving financial records and internal procedures. The two issues appeared completely unrelated. But as events continued unfolding, that assumption began to change. Because according to several accounts, the security officer was carrying information that could potentially explain why certain questions had remained unanswered for so long. And once that individual reportedly decided to speak, the entire situation took a dramatic turn. The possibility that a member of the royal security team might possess crucial information immediately changed the nature of the situation. What had previously looked like a question about paperwork and internal procedures was now evolving into something far more serious. According to accounts that later circulated among royal observers, the security officer did not come forward dramatically. There were no public statements, no immediate accusations, and no explosive confrontation. Instead, the information reportedly emerged quietly through private conversations and internal discussions that initially attracted very little attention. That alone raised eyebrows. Why would someone responsible for protecting the royal household suddenly become connected to a growing controversy? The answer, some commentators suggested, may lie in what the officer had allegedly witnessed over a period of time. At first, the details appeared insignificant. Unusual meetings, unexpected visitors, conversations that seemed oddly tense whenever certain topics were discussed. None of these observations proved anything on their own. Yet together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The security officer reportedly noticed something else as well. Whenever questions arose regarding specific records or decisions, certain individuals appeared unusually eager to shut down further discussion. Explanations were offered quickly. Alternative topics were introduced. Attention seemed to shift away from the original concerns almost immediately. For some people, that might have been enough to end the matter. For Prince William, it reportedly had the opposite effect. The future king is often described as someone who values preparation and thoroughness. Rather than reacting emotionally, he is said to prefer gathering information before reaching conclusions. If something appeared unusual, he wanted to understand why. That approach reportedly led to a series of quiet reviews behind the scenes. The objective was simple: separate rumor from reality, fact from speculation, coincidence from pattern. Yet the more information was examined, the harder that task became. Because every new detail seemed to point toward another unanswered question. Why were certain individuals becoming increasingly nervous? Why did discussions about routine administrative matters trigger such strong reactions? And why was a security officer reportedly beginning to feel uncomfortable about what he had observed? The atmosphere surrounding the situation was gradually changing. What started as curiosity was turning into concern. According to some royal commentators, this was the point where Prince William allegedly began paying closer attention to testimony from people who normally remained far from public view. Staff members, administrative personnel, individuals whose responsibilities placed them near important events without placing them in the headlines. Their observations did not provide definitive answers, but they did reveal something important. The same names kept appearing, again and again, not in dramatic ways, not through obvious misconduct, but through repeated connections to situations that seemed increasingly difficult to explain. That repetition became impossible to dismiss. Meanwhile, the security officer reportedly found himself facing a difficult decision. Remain silent or speak. Neither option was easy. Remaining silent meant living with growing doubts. Speaking risked attracting attention from people who would prefer those questions remain unanswered. For a period of time, observers claim he chose caution. But pressure has a way of building, and the more uncertainty surrounding the situation increased, the more difficult silence became. Then came a development that changed everything. According to several accounts, information surfaced suggesting that certain decisions may not have been as independent as they initially appeared. Discussions that were once considered routine suddenly acquired new significance. Connections that seemed coincidental began looking much more deliberate. For the first time, some people reportedly started asking whether influence rather than procedure had shaped key decisions. That possibility transformed the conversation overnight. Because if influence had played a role, then the issue was no longer about administrative confusion. It was about accountability. And accountability is where even small questions can become major problems. By this stage, Prince William reportedly understood that the situation could not be ignored indefinitely. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many explanations failed to fully address the concerns being raised. Something was missing, and according to those who follow the story closely, the missing piece may have been sitting with the very person nobody initially expected, the security officer, because while others were focused on documents, approvals, and internal records, he allegedly possessed something entirely different, a first-hand account. And once that account reportedly began reaching the right people, the entire investigation started moving in a very different direction. What happened next would reportedly transform suspicion into something much harder to dismiss. The reported account from the security officer did not instantly solve every mystery. In fact, according to those familiar with the growing controversy, it created an entirely new set of questions. That is often what happens when an investigation begins moving beyond assumptions and into first-hand observations. Instead of simplifying the story, new information tends to reveal just how complicated the situation may actually be. And that appears to be exactly what happened here. As Prince William's reported review continued, the security officer allegedly provided details about several encounters and conversations that had previously seemed unimportant. Individually, none of them appeared particularly dramatic. Yet when combined with the concerns already surrounding the records under review, they began forming a much clearer picture. Observers later claimed that the officer described seeing unusual activity surrounding key discussions connected to the matter. Certain meetings reportedly took place without attracting attention. Certain individuals appeared unusually interested in controlling information. And whenever questions became too specific, conversations allegedly shifted in a different direction. Again, none of this proved wrongdoing, but it did raise an obvious question. Why would anyone be so concerned about routine scrutiny if there was nothing to hide? That question reportedly became one of the central issues facing those attempting to understand the situation. Meanwhile, Prince William's approach remained consistent. Rather than focusing on dramatic allegations, he reportedly concentrated on verifiable information. Documents were reviewed, timelines were compared, statements were examined against known facts. And as that process continued, something unexpected began to happen. Details that once seemed unrelated started connecting with one another. The same dates appeared repeatedly. The same names surfaced repeatedly. The same explanations surfaced repeatedly. What initially looked like coincidence was starting to resemble a pattern. According to some commentators, this was the moment when concern reportedly shifted into determination. Because patterns are difficult to ignore, especially when they continue appearing no matter where investigators look. At the same time, reports suggest that pressure inside royal circles was quietly increasing. Rumors were spreading, speculation was growing, and those connected to the situation were becoming increasingly aware that questions were no longer confined to a small group of insiders. The issue was expanding, and with expansion came risk. For some individuals, that risk reportedly triggered a series of decisions that would later attract even greater scrutiny. Observers claim there were growing efforts to manage the narrative surrounding the controversy. Explanations became more frequent. Reassurances became more common. Yet instead of calming concerns, these efforts allegedly had the opposite effect. People began asking why so much energy was being devoted to a matter that was supposedly insignificant. The contradiction was difficult to overlook. If there was no problem, why did everyone seem so concerned about discussing it? That question reportedly lingered over every subsequent development. Then came the turning point. According to accounts discussed by royal commentators, investigators allegedly uncovered information that challenged one of the central assumptions surrounding the controversy. Until that point, many believed the issue revolved primarily around records and documentation. But new evidence reportedly suggested the situation could be far broader than anyone initially realized. Suddenly, attention shifted away from paperwork and toward influence. Who had encouraged certain decisions? Who benefited from those decisions? Who possessed the authority to shape outcomes behind the scenes? These questions transformed the investigation, because influence is often far more difficult to track than documents. Yet influence also leaves traces. And according to those following the story, those traces were becoming increasingly visible. For Prince William, this reportedly represented a critical moment. The objective was no longer simply determining what happened. The objective was understanding why it happened. That distinction changed everything. Because once motives enter the picture, every previous event begins looking different. Every conversation carries new meaning. Every decision invites new scrutiny. Every explanation is re-examined. And that process reportedly led investigators toward a discovery that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The security officer's account had opened the door. The review of records had expanded the investigation. Now, for the first time, some observers believed they were approaching the answer to the question that had lingered from the very beginning. What was really happening behind the scenes? And according to those accounts, the next revelation would bring Prince William closer than ever to finding out. By the time the investigation reportedly reached this stage, the atmosphere surrounding the situation had changed completely. What began as a series of routine questions had evolved into a matter attracting attention from some of the most senior figures connected to the monarchy. The stakes were no longer limited to administrative concerns or internal disagreements. The discussion now centered on something far more significant: trust. And once trust becomes the issue, every decision carries greater consequences. According to accounts discussed by royal commentators, Prince William's review had reached a critical point. The information gathered so far had revealed patterns, inconsistencies, and testimony that could not easily be dismissed. Yet one problem remained. Patterns create suspicion. Evidence creates certainty. The future king reportedly needed to understand whether the concerns being raised could be supported by information strong enough to withstand scrutiny. That is where the reported testimony from the security officer became increasingly important. Observers claimed the officer's account was no longer being viewed as an isolated statement. Instead, investigators allegedly began comparing it against timelines, records, and reports that had already been collected during previous stages of the review. What happened next reportedly surprised even some of those involved. Details that initially seemed unrelated began aligning with remarkable precision. Dates matched, meetings matched, decisions matched. Explanations that once appeared convincing suddenly faced new questions. The growing consistency between different sources of information reportedly transformed the investigation. For the first time, some observers believed the situation could be approaching a decisive moment. Meanwhile, pressure inside royal circles allegedly continued increasing. As more questions surfaced, maintaining silence became increasingly difficult. Individuals connected to the controversy reportedly understood that the review was becoming more comprehensive with each passing day. And according to some commentators, that growing pressure may have led to a crucial mistake. Because history shows that when people believe scrutiny is closing in, they often become more focused on protecting themselves than protecting the truth. That reaction can create problems of its own. Observers claim that several actions taken during this period attracted fresh attention from those reviewing the matter. Instead of reducing concerns, these developments allegedly generated even more questions. Why were certain explanations changing? Why were some accounts becoming less consistent over time? And why did efforts to reassure observers seem to produce the opposite effect? The deeper investigators looked, the more difficult those questions became to answer. For Prince William, the reported objective remained unchanged: find the truth, regardless of where it leads. That determination reportedly earned respect from many royal commentators who viewed the situation as a test of leadership. If concerns existed, they believed they should be addressed. If mistakes had been made, they should be understood. Yet despite months of speculation, one final piece of the puzzle still appeared missing: a connection. Something capable of bringing together the various strands of information that had emerged throughout the review. Then came what some observers described as the breakthrough. According to reports, investigators allegedly identified information that linked several previously separate questions into a single narrative. What once appeared to be unrelated events now seemed connected by a common thread. Suddenly, the controversy looked very different. The focus was no longer on isolated incidents. It was on the possibility that multiple developments had been influencing one another from the very beginning. That realization reportedly changed the direction of the investigation once again. Instead of asking whether concerns existed, the discussion shifted toward understanding their full scope. And for those following the story, that distinction was enormous. Because once separate questions begin pointing toward the same conclusion, uncertainty starts giving way to clarity. Royal commentators claim this was the moment many insiders realized the situation could not simply fade away. Too much information had emerged. Too many connections had been identified, Too many questions had already been raised. The review was approaching its most important stage. And according to those accounts, what happened next would reportedly bring the entire controversy into the open, forcing answers that could no longer be delayed. Because after months of questions, speculation, and investigation, Prince William was finally approaching the moment where the truth would have to confront the public discussion surrounding it. And when that moment arrived, the consequences would reportedly be impossible to ignore. As the reported investigation approached its final stage, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The controversy was no longer about a single allegation. It was no longer about one document, one conversation, or even one individual. Instead, the focus had shifted toward a much larger question. How had a situation that initially appeared minor managed to generate so many unanswered questions, so much internal concern, and such intense public speculation? According to royal commentators who follow the story closely, this was the moment when everything reportedly began coming together. The security officer's account, the administrative concerns, the inconsistencies that had surfaced during reviews, the growing pressure inside royal circles. Individually, each element told only part of the story. Together, they reportedly painted a far clearer picture. Observers claimed that by this point, Prince William's primary objective was no longer discovering new information. Instead, the focus had shifted toward evaluating everything that had already been gathered and determining what conclusions could reasonably be supported. That distinction mattered, because in situations involving high-profile institutions, facts and speculation often become intertwined. Separating one from the other requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to follow evidence rather than assumptions. According to several accounts, that process reportedly led to some difficult conversations behind the scenes. Questions that had been postponed could no longer be avoided. Explanations that once seemed sufficient faced renewed scrutiny. Individuals who previously felt confident reportedly found themselves under increasing pressure to provide answers. For many observers, this represented the most significant phase of the entire story. Not because of dramatic confrontations, not because of sensational accusations, but because accountability had finally entered the discussion. And accountability changes everything. Once people begin demanding answers, uncertainty becomes much harder to sustain. Meanwhile, royal commentators noted another interesting development. Public interest in the controversy continued growing despite the absence of official confirmation regarding many of the claims circulating online. Viewers, readers, and royal watchers seemed less interested in individual allegations than in the broader themes emerging from the discussion. Trust, transparency, responsibility, leadership. Those themes resonated far beyond any single controversy. Perhaps that explains why the story continued attracting attention long after many expected interest to fade. At its core, the debate was never simply about one event. It was about confidence in the institutions and individuals entrusted with protecting a legacy that stretches across generations. For supporters of Prince William, the reported investigation reinforced an image that has become increasingly associated with the future king. A willingness to ask questions, a determination to seek clarity, a belief that difficult issues should be addressed rather than ignored. Others remain cautious. They argue that many claims surrounding the controversy remain unverified and that speculation should never be mistaken for established fact. That perspective is important as well, because in an era where rumors travel faster than evidence, careful judgment becomes more valuable than ever. Yet regardless of where people stand, one thing appears clear. The discussion has highlighted just how closely royal watchers examine every development involving the monarchy. Every decision, every relationship, every controversy, every unanswered question. Nothing escapes attention for long. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Influence brings scrutiny, power brings responsibility, and public trust, once questioned, often becomes the most difficult thing to restore. As for the allegations themselves, many questions remain open, and opinions continue to differ sharply depending on which sources people trust and which interpretations they find most convincing. But the debate shows no signs of disappearing anytime soon. Because for many observers, the story was never solely about what happened. It was about what the events might reveal regarding the future direction of the monarchy, the expectations placed upon its leaders, and the standards by which those leaders are judged. And that conversation may only be beginning. So what do you think? Did Prince William's reported determination to pursue answers reflect the kind of leadership many expect from a future king? Or do you believe that stories like this often grow larger through speculation than through verified facts? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss future royal stories, royal analysis, and the latest developments involving Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Queen Camilla, and the future of the British monarchy.